Hello, I'm Li Hao. In this video, we're going to talk about hydration. So we have talked about how we can use client-side component API, server-side component API, we talk about compilers API, and naturally, I'm not sure whether it's natural, but we are going to talk about hydration. So what is hydration? And how do we use hydration in Svelte? Well, we're going to check that out. Okay, so what is hydration? So hydration is a process where you have content in HTML that is coming from the server, be it rendered dynamically whenever there's a new request, or the HTML is already generated ahead of time via pre-rendering, and you get this HTML downloaded to your browser and it creates all the DOM elements. Right? So you already have existing DOM elements, which is the same elements that you might have, or you could have, or you would have created using on a client side. Over by your Svelte components. So instead of recreating elements, you look at the existing DOM elements and say, hey, actually they are the same element. We are going to use these existing DOM elements instead of creating everything from scratch. Then you would do the process called a hydration, in which you try to go through on elements in your template that you are supposed to create, and instead of creating them, you're pointing your reference to elements that's existed on the DOM. And later on, when there's interactions, since you already have the reference to the DOM, you can immediately make changes to it, react to any user interactions. So that is in essence what is hydration. And in this video, we're gonna take a look at how we can do hydration in Svelte. Are you ready? Okay, so here I have my component written ahead of time. So I have two props, name and language. At the same time, the name is actually a state where I bind an input to this name variable, right? So you can see I will expect this when on the client side, when I hydrate, I still have the same input and I can make changes to that input. And over here, I have some elements that shows the content based on whatever the data that we're getting. So first thing of hydration is you probably want to render this out in the server side, right? You want to have a way to generate the HTML first, and then you serve that HTML to the user. So here what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to come over here, index.js, and I'm going to write all that out. Right, so first is I'm going to import the Svelte compiler from Svelte compiler. So here I'm going to write out the raw process, the manual process that you would have to write if you are not using any frameworks such as Swapper, or in future maybe SvelteKit. Right, this is what is being done under the hood. I'm going to take a look at like the raw way of doing things. Right, so we have a Svelte compiler and we're going to compile our code using a targets to SSR, so that we get a function and we can call this function to get us a HTML. Right, so first thing is I'm going to call Svelte compiler .compile, and we need to pass in the code. Right, so first is we need to read our code, so we're going to use import file system from Node API, and as well as a path, so that we can read out the path. So our source code would be here. Path to component is path.join. Okay, and then we're gonna read out the source code. Svelte code equals to read file sync. So I'm going to use a synchronous version of the read file, so that I don't have to wait for anything. I can just read it out. So I'm going to pass in a path to component, and encoding will be UTF-8. So here I'm going to pass in this code in, and I'm going to specify my targets. I think it's called generate to SSR. So I'm going to generate an SSR code. And also, most importantly, because we want to do hydration, we also need to pass in a flag called hydratable to be true. So this will generate the function the function that we end up getting that will return us a HTML will be a hydratable HTML. So Svelte may do some optimization or add some reference here and there, so that it's easier for us to find out where the element is later on when we want to hydrate this from the HTML that's being written from our code. Right here, if you take a look, we have JS code and CSS. I think we can leave the CSS alone. We get the JS, and so now js.code would be the code output that is a function, right? So what we can do is we are going to take this piece of code. Okay, so first is let's take a look at what this is. Right, this is a piece of code, JavaScript code that is compiled using SSR mode, right? Probably we would, let's see. Yeah, so we will have to call this, we will have to treat this as a module and then call it later, right? So I think the easiest way is we're gonna write this piece of code into a file and then we execute the file later on. So I'm gonna do that. So right, file sync, and then we're gonna say path.join Svelte component.ssr.js. So we're gonna write this content into a file and we're gonna import it later on. So this file is it's an AS module, and right now we are running in CommonJS. So probably we also say the out. What's that? We need the option called, let's see. Formats, right? We're gonna change our format to CGS, and we're gonna write this file, the JavaScript code that's generated into a file. So if I run this, you'll see that now we have a new file called component.ssr, which is in CommonJS, and probably we can run it. So the way to run it is to just require it. Right, so probably I'm gonna save this path as a path to SSR code. So SSR component, and remember we use exports.defaults, right? So we can probably need .default to get this value. Now if you console out SSR component, it'll be object with a render function, right? So we're gonna call this render function to render our component into a HTML code. And so now we're gonna call this render, and we're gonna pass in some props. So the first, so here if we take a look at our code, there's two props, name and language. So I'm gonna say name would be Svelte, and language is also called Svelte, right? Okay, maybe name is Lihao. Okay, so I'm gonna call render, and this will return us some contents, right? So if you take a look at server-side component API, this is the results. Result will return us the head, the HTML, and the CSS. Right? So head, HTML, and CSS. So we're gonna piece all this together, and then we'll to form HTML content, and we're gonna send that content to a user. Right? So here, what we are gonna do is we are going to firstly. Okay, so my plan is I'm gonna write this HTML file into a folder called public, so that later on we're gonna open this folder, right? So this folder will be I'm gonna create this folder now, public. So this folder will have our HTML file, and later on we're gonna compile the JavaScript code, and we're gonna include that JavaScript code in this public folder as well. So here we're gonna say let's see. Okay, so the output HTML would be looks like this. We have HTML, and then we have a head. This is where we put in the head content, and also we can have some style. This is where we put in our CSS, and then we have, okay, I think style tag should be placed inside the head. Right, nicely formatted. Okay, and then we have our body, and I guess that's where we will put in our HTML our HTML content, right? So here we have our output HTML that looks like this, and we're gonna write this HTML output to a file inside public folder, right? So I'm gonna do that now. So write file sync path.join public index HTML content. Alright, so we're gonna write this file into a HTML file into the index HTML, right? So when I run this, see that now I have a new file over here and have all our content. So wait, hold on. CSS is not so CSS is not an object, which we will have to write the css.code in. Right, now we have everything ready, and if you try to open this file over the browser, it's gonna say open public index. Oops, sorry. Public index HTML. Oh, whoops. You see this now, okay? But there's no interaction yet. So when I type something, there's no reactivity at all because we haven't loaded our JavaScript code. So now the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna compile our code for JavaScript for the client side and write it to a file in a public folder as well. So next thing is we're gonna come over here. We're gonna have the same parts, but we'll still do a compilation, but now we're gonna compile for our client side and make sure that we also have high-readable to true, and we format will be, I think we can leave the format as it is, as ESM. Okay, and next thing is let's see. And okay, so because on our server side we already have like CSS inserted, so here we can just don't have to compile CSS for our client side component. So if you check here, there's this flag called CSS, right? So CSS we can file as false because we don't need it, right? So now we get our JavaScript code and I'm gonna write it into a file. So fs.write file sync. Now we're gonna have this one, and I'm gonna say index.js, js.code, and encoding is UTF-8. Okay, so now if you run this, oops, sorry. Okay, so we have to rename this. I'm gonna say js.client-side.js. Okay, gonna build again. You don't see anything different yet, but we have a new file created add over here index.js, right? So here we are gonna we need to add this file into our index reference to this file in our HTML so that we can load this JavaScript by the browser. So let's see, we can come over here and add a script tag. Source will be index.js. And because we are using import statements, so we also need to make sure that the type is module. Right, so let's try run that again. And if you take a look over here, it says that we need to be a relative path. Okay, so the thing is we can't load a module script using in a file protocol, right? So if we open this file like this, we can't really serve this file. So what we need is a file server that serves all the folders from the public folder. So here I'm going to open a new tab and run a HTTP server to serve the public folder. So here I'm going to visit this, and it will still serve our index.html, right? If you take a look now, we realize that, we loaded index.js and still not working. Take a look at, I think index.js is loaded correctly. I'm not sure, maybe because of this, right? How are we going to import from svelte/internal? Because if I come over here and say port 8080/svelte internal, this does not lead to anything. So the file svelte/internal is giving us a 404. We can't find this file. Fair enough. This file is not even in the public folder at all. So if you're using a bundler, this shouldn't be a problem, because a bundler will look through all its dependency and try to bundle everything into one file. In our case, we don't have this. We don't have a bundle. We only compile one Svelte component code into like one normal JavaScript module, right? So all these import statements are still there. We will have to figure a way to find this file and resolve it ourselves, right? So first thing is, this is not like a valid import statement. You can't really import like this. It's either where you start with a slash, where it says it's absolute from the root folder. Root, as in this case, is the public folder, or relative to the file, the current file, which is public index.js relative to the current file, right? So we're gonna what we're gonna do is we'll try to copy this file from the node modules and paste it into the public folder. So here this will be coming from a root folder, svelte/internal, and also you need an extension so that you know what file to find, right? It's unlike you when you're doing a bundling, the bundler will figure out that, okay, svelte internal, which file am I reading from? In this case, if you take a look at the node modules, you'll find that svelte/internal, there's a package.json. So a bundler will look at this file and then figure the next step. So if it's internal, it's a folder, and it finds a package.json, it'll figure, okay, let's read this file and figure out, okay, a bundle will figure out whether to get like the main file or the module files, or and try to get resolved to that file. But in our case, we don't have a bundle, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy this index.mjs file and I'm going to paste it into the public folder, right? So these are like manual works. So I'm going to paste the index. So I'm going to have root path svelte/internals.mjs. Okay, so here I need to rename my file to be svelte/internal.mjs as well, so that I can resolve to this, I can find this file, right? Luckily, this file does not have any more import statements, so I think that will be the extent of it. So let's save this. Let's save our index.js as well. Let's try to refresh again. Interesting. This is not resolving from the, let's see. Bundle will load this file, index.js type module. Oh, we didn't close our script tag. That's why there's problems over here. Okay, so let's see. Let's come over here and close our script tag. I think we just come over here and do it ourselves in the build code as well. Okay, and let's refresh again. Okay, in this case, we loaded index.js as well as internal m.js, right? So everything is loaded. But if you try to run, nothing happened yet, right? So what's the problem now? The problem is we have this component, we loaded, but we haven't really used it, right? Recall the client-side component API where we actually import this component and then we actually use it in a sense where we instantiate this component, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move this index.js file into a component.js, and I'm going to create another file called index.js, and here I am going to write import component from component.js. Right, and then I am going to create an instance. So component equals new component. And now I need to figure out my targets. So in our case, the target is the body because we pasted everything HTML into the body. So I'm gonna say, I'm gonna come over here and say targets equals to the body. Wait, sorry, document.body, and then hydratable. Let's see. So let's look at the component API, hydratable. Oops. I think it's called the hydrate. We need to pass it as true. Now we need to specify the same props as what we get over here as well. In our server side, when we render this component, our component, let's see, where are we? Okay, we don't, when we call this props is Li Hao and Svelte, so we're gonna copy this over as well. You see there's a lot of things to make sure everything goes correctly, right? But when you have something like a Sepper or Svelte kits, all this is being done for you. So here we instantiate. Okay, so the most important thing that is different from what we done previously is that this has to be true, hydrate has to be true, and I have to make sure that this our code that we built is hydratable to be true for server side as well as the client side. So let's save this, save everything, and let's try to refresh again. This time round, we loaded index.js, component, and internal m.js. Now hopefully there's no error in the console, except we didn't have a favicon, right? But now we already mount our component. So if I try to type something, you see that now everything is reactive, right? So so that is how it's gonna be how it works, right? So now you maybe will ask me like, oh, okay, it feels like nothing's different. If your HTML has no elements at all, right? If I remove everything from the body, I remove all this like this, nothing inside the body. If I refresh again, everything still works fine. How do I know the hydration kicks in, and how do I know whether it's being hydrated correctly or not? Well, let's take a look. So let's restore back let me put back the original elements, right? And let's refresh. Everything looks normal. So how do I know whether hydration works? Usually this is how I'm gonna take a look. First is I'm gonna open up the network condition. Sorry, let me find where is the say network condition. So I use Command P to open up this drawer and find like you can manually type this arrow symbol and say network condition. So here I'm gonna okay, sorry, I'm not sure. I'm not going for network condition. First is I'm gonna disable JavaScript disable. So what this do is that now I load my page. This whole thing is so-called server rendered because we of course in our case it's more like we don't dynamically render this page on per request, but we render ahead of time when we run our code to generate a HTML, right? So this HTML is already rendered, is being generated. So here you get this static HTML that has no JavaScript at all, so no interaction at all. You can still type, but no reactivity at all, right? So here what I can do is I am going to look at this elements, right? Look over here. These are the elements, and if I turn on JavaScript, what I expect is that later on when I refresh, let's see. Okay, I think I missed one step. So first is I'm gonna come over here and set a timeout. No, timeout is a bit uncontrollable. Okay, let me add another button in the HTML. Let me add one button. So it's okay that you have extra elements over here. Hydrate, I'm gonna call it. ID equals hydrate. So I'm gonna have this extra button over here, and in our code we will only hydrate our HTML when I click this hydrate button, right? So I'm gonna say you will see hydrate, and then I will instantiate our component. So here is where we actually do the hydration, right? So let's try refresh again. So everything is done, but if you look at console, there's no hydrate yet, meaning we haven't hydrate our elements. We try to type something, nothing changed, right? So if you inspect elements, you see that these are the elements that is created from the HTML written from when we do the rendering. Now, first thing is I'm gonna take a look at this element and I'm gonna store the reference of this h1. So this is, okay, I'm gonna store it as a variable. H1 equals to this. So now h1 is pointing to this h1 element. Right? So what I want to see is that later on when I hydrate, this is still the same h1 element rather than being discarded and thrown away. And I want to make sure that later on it's still the same element and the input is still the same input. So I'm gonna do this as well. Input equals to this. The input is still the same input, but then the input and the h1 has interactivity, has reactivity, right? That's what we're gonna aim for when we click the hydrate. So at the same time, you can stare at this screen. Usually whenever element has changed, whenever something has done to the elements, it will flashes, right? So let's click. See, everything is flashing. I'm not sure whether we're hydrating correctly, but let's take a look. So h1, yeah, it's still referring to the same element. So we didn't create a new h1. This is still the h1 that we referenced to just now before we hydrate, and this is the new. This is still the same one that we see on the screen. So no new h1 being created, right? If I look for input, this is still the same input elements that you see just now, and the one that's right now we are looking at is still the same input element. So no new input element being created, is still the same input element, but right now the input element is reactive, right? When you try to type something, you see that it's reflected, reacted, and yeah, things change, right? So this is hydration. Hydration is you get the HTML being rendered when you pre-rendered, meaning render ahead of time or render when you have a request. You get that HTML served to the user. And at the same time, you compile the code for the client side, which when you instantiate, you should pass the flag called hydrate, so that it will, instead of recreate any new elements, it will look for the existing elements and then point reference to them, right? So if I don't have this hydrate to true, what it means is that you ask Svelte to actually recreate this component. And rather than recreate, actually what Svelte will do is it will create a new set of elements inserted at the end of the body, right? We learned that we can have as many elements we have on the screen. When you create an element, it will actually create a component. Your mount component actually will insert at the end of the children, right? So if you don't have hydrate, this is what's gonna happen. But if you pass hydrate to true, then it will claim existing elements as the elements that it treated like existing elements as elements that it will be creating, and then pointing reference to them, and then add event listeners so that whenever something has changed, it will update the existing elements. Right, so that is hydration. I hope that you learned something in this video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below and give me a thumbs up and share this video if you find this very helpful to you. Right, as always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next video is out. So see ya. Bye bye.